Welcome to the Sierra Health Foundation. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our speaker series event this afternoon. My name is Kai Hang, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Vice President for Programs and Partnership here at the Sierra Health Foundation and the Center. We are really excited about this afternoon's presentation. This is part of the Sierra Health Foundation Speaker Series. Our event today is focused around the theme of race, racism, and otherness. And we are very pleased and proud and honored to feature John A. Powell. We're honored to have an incredible panel of speakers joining John in conversation this afternoon, who will be speaking to projects and values that address issues specific to communities that have been historically, commonly, and currently othered. Before we get started, though, we would like to welcome those who have joined together in our Merced office and in offices and homes around the state viewing this event through our live stream. This has been a very popular event, and for those of you who have been able to get a seat here, we're proud to have you here, but know that there was a very long waiting line. And for those who can't be here in person with us, they are joining us through the various technology. We will be taking audience questions at the end of the panel discussion. We will have a microphone for those in the room, and those live streaming may use the hashtag SHF Speaker Series to send in questions via Twitter. We also invite everyone to use this hashtag for follow-up comments, questions, and ideas for future events. And with that, I would like to welcome spoken word artists from the Sacramento Area Youth Speaks to share their views to kick off our discussion. So I would like at this moment to ask Destiny and Keisha to join me up here. Thank you.
Somebody once told me, you're powerful, your voice is powerful, and don't you forget it. But then I wonder, when I speak, why don't I hear the powerfulness in me? Somebody once told me, to love yourself, you have to love every part, flaws and all. But then I wonder, when I look in the mirror, why don't I love the white in me? I told my mom I wish I was 100% black. But then I take that back, because the way society views it is if you ratchet, then you black. Dark is ugly and light is cute. Oh, so girl, you blessed if you mixed. Them curls in your head, them colored eyes gave to you by your master. Slave owner made you light by mixing you with white and stealing the melanin from in your skin. Like if you mix cream with coffee, turn you black to brown. You took my self-worth, you took my dignity, you turned me black to brown because you stole my melanin. And now I'm called light-skinned, when we all know dark roots are the best roots. You can't plant those peas in that white soil, so how the heck we gonna eat? You need me. My melanin in my skin, you need me. So don't confuse my melanin, don't confuse my dark roots, like I can't have colored eyes, like my curls can't be loose. You need me. Don't think my coffee needs any cream. So how am I supposed to love all of me when not only am I not accepted in one culture, but I'm not accepted in two? You too light, you too dark, your hair too kinky, your curls too loose. You talk white, but you got black futures. I know this history of this white ain't me. I'm 100% black at heart, but I know that's not what you see. I'm as black as Tanisha. I'm as black as LaQuisha. I ain't no Ashley. I'm Keisha. My name a little different, so aren't I black? My name is Keisha Odessa Marde. Do I sound black enough for you?
Why we gotta scream to be heard? Why we gotta die to be recognized for being alive? Are our screams like triggers that spring you into action? Why? Why we gotta die? Oh, I'm sorry. Did I interrupt your dinner? Did I interrupt your polite conversation about the weather? Oh, excuse me. Was I too loud? Did I shock you into existence? Are you woke now? Do you see me? Do you see these wounds, or shall I paint a clearer picture? Death don't get no clearer. Is the pain not evident in my voice? Are your butts at the edge of your seats now? Are you leaning forward? Are you inching closer? Are you drawn to my sorrow? Are you drawn to my pain? This seed was planted in your spine a long time ago. Although placed with nefarious intent, you still blossom. You still stand rigid and firm, though your petals are a little wilted. But I see you, flower child. You are born with God in you. You are born in light, so they try to snuff you out every time you shine. No wonder this hatred never dies. Black power is real. No wonder I see envy in their eyes. We are born far beyond this earth. No wonder their strategy was to dehumanize. How you going to dehumanize our celestial bodies? No wonder they fear our minds. Knowledge is freedom, so they try to cripple our ability to think. We were never meant to fit within the confines of that little world, so they'll build fences around our neighborhoods, built to withstand 1,000 storms. We ain't going nowhere, we ain't getting out the hood. They place cops in the neighborhoods, say they're there to protect us, but really they're just guards against our prison cells to make sure we don't get out and disturb their white picket fences. Why y'all keep placing policemen out of their element? So they can keep killing our brothers and blame it on being scared and nervous? See, I can't take it anymore. I can't hear my mother's crying anymore. Shh, 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 shh. It's gonna be all right. Mama, it's gonna be all right. Stop crying. Stop crying, Mama. Shh, shh, shh. Why we gotta scream to be heard? Give us justice while we're living. We are done asking. We are not too loud to live.
Thank you so much, Destiny and Keisha. Youth Voices for Social Change, and how amazing for us to start off our afternoon together then with your voice and perspective. I am now delighted to welcome John A. Powell to start this much-needed conversation on race, racism, and otherness. I think you all have John's biography, but let me just say that John is an internationally recognized author and expert in the areas of civil rights and civil liberties in a wide range of issues, including race, structural racism, ethnicity, housing, poverty, and democracy. John also has written extensively on structural racism, racial justice, concentrated poverty, and urban sprawl, housing, voting rights, affirmative action, racial and ethnic identity, and targeted universalism. So with that, I would like to welcome John to the podium. Thank you, John.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. So you probably can see me, and I'm not wearing heels. But if not, hopefully you can hear me at least. So it's a delight to be here in Sacramento and to be at the Sierra Foundation. I don't know how many of you are directly affiliated with the foundation, but I had an opportunity to visit their website and talk to a few people and doing just phenomenal work. And so I'm going to share with you some thoughts today about othering and health and race, and hopefully you'll find this useful as you go forward. One of the things we know is that we're all situated in structures, and structures matter. But these structures are not equally designed, and structures actually advantage and disadvantage people. And structures themselves can be expressions of belonging or expressions of othering. And so part of the thing is to pay attention to these structures, and usually they're largely invisible to us. We don't think about them. We don't notice that there's not a ramp until someone shows up with a wheelchair. We don't notice that there's not facilities for people who are blind until we have a blind friend. So we just assume that the structures are designed neutrally, and no structure is designed neutrally. They're designed to do some work, and we need to make sure we design structures to include and to belong. And so part of this conversation is about belonging. So you might have come in here thinking the big problem of the day was housing or policing or food, and all those are serious problems. But I want to suggest to you that the problem of the 21st century, not just in the United States, not just in California, but in the world and in Sacramento, is the problem of othering. The problem of who belongs and who does not belong. Do we not belong because we are quote unquote mixed race? Do we not belong because we speak differently? So there are all ways, many different ways, which we could say to someone, you don't belong, or you do belong. And we say that not just with our words, but with our policies, with our resources, with our structures. So there are a number of ways to communicate to someone they don't belong. And obviously in the United States, one of the historical foundations of a group not belonging has been race. But it's not the only one. It's also, we use Native people. We also say people from different countries, immigrants, Muslims, people who have different abilities, people who have different sexual orientations. There are all these different ways in which we say, you don't belong. And it's not us saying it just to each other. It's how government gets organized and how it organizes space. So the very notion, for example, of segregation is to say, you don't belong in my space. I had the opportunity of having lunch with the staff today, and I had to step out for a call with Starbucks. And so two young black men in Philadelphia show up in Starbucks. And the barista says, you don't belong. This is Starbucks. This is not a space for young black men. Or someone getting on an airplane with their children, an African woman, and someone saying, you don't belong. And they call the police and they come. Or a young Yale student studying and get tired, decides to take a break. And her dorm mates calls the police to say, you don't belong. Or black people in Oakland eating barbecue. Let me repeat that. Black people in Oakland eating barbecue. That's what we do in Oakland. But someone decides, you don't belong. This is our space, get out. And I was sharing with Chet, I used to live in San Francisco, and there were logos painted on the sidewalks around Dolores Park that read, get rich or get out, saying if you're not rich, you don't belong. We have to counter that. I am because you are. I am because you are. And so this fight about who belongs, who does not belong, really is foundational in this country. We're still fighting a civil war, and right now we have to say the South is doing a pretty good job. They're contesting the idea that we can have a United States where people belong. So this question of who belongs is all around us. And these are two books one written by Samuel Huntington, and he wrote a book literally titled, Who Are We? And he says we're not a country of immigrants, we're a country of settlers. That the country belonged to the settlers, and everybody else is a guest. Everybody else has an asterisk by their name. They don't really belong, and if they don't behave right, we can ask them to leave. You say, Dr. Huntington, who are these settlers you keep talking about? And he tells us. He says they're the Anglos and the Saxons. They're Christians, not just Christians, they're Protestants. They speak English, and they look a lot like me. But then we can talk to our friend Jeff Chang down the peninsula at Stanford, and Jeff says, who we be? And he says, we be a diverse people. We be people from all over the world with many different languages and customs and religions. And he's written a newer book called We're Gonna Be All Right. Now you notice that Huntington's book is backwards looking. He looks at a past that never was. He looks at a past when the country was just populated by Anglos and Saxons. What happened to the Native Americans? Weren't they here already? A small footnote that Huntington wants to skip over. Jeff Chang actually tells us to look to the future. The future is now. My friend Tony Ayton liked to say, When people ask him where he's from, he says, I'm from the future. I'm from California. The future is now. We are the people. All of us. All of us belong. So othering is a funny word. It's a wonky word. And so I dug deep into the bowels of academia to pull this out to help you. So stop othering me. What's othering? Well, your kind wouldn't understand. Your kind wouldn't understand. So the country's growing more diverse. And it's not just something that's happening in the country, the world is growing more diverse. This is a result of many things. Technology. It's easier to travel, it's cheaper to travel. Between 300 and 400 million people now live outside of their home country. And most of those people are coming from the south to the north. And Robert Putnam discovered in the 1990s that as diversity across some important sectors, because there's all kinds of diversities, but he's talking about diversities that's across particular sectors happen, it creates anxiety. And anxiety is not good or bad, it just is nervous energy, if you will. And anytime there's a lot of change, we as humans have a little difficult time processing. We feel anxious about it. And what we're seeing now is that there's change going on very fast. The country's becoming less Anglo, less Saxon. It's becoming more black, brown, and other. And as this diversity keeps changing, this anxiety keeps growing. When people feel anxious, we actually don't know what to do with it. Why am I feeling at ease or dis-ease? And we use narratives, stories, leaders to actually tell us what to do with this anxiety. To tell us that this anxiety is something we should be afraid of, or tell us we're getting anxious because something good is about to happen. I often use the example of my granddaughter. She's now 8, but when she was 5, she carried her to go to kindergarten. And slightly embellished story, but useful nonetheless. So she goes to my daughter, and she says, I don't know what kindergarten is. What is kindergarten? I'm feeling a little anxious. And so my daughter has a number of options. So one option is to tell this story. Tomorrow you go to kindergarten. And in kindergarten, you're going to meet a lot of big kids. Some of them are bullies. They may take your lunch money. They may say mean things about you. Now my granddaughter's anxiety has shifted from anxiety to fear. Or my daughter could say, you're going to school tomorrow, you're going to make new friends. You're going to learn to read and to draw. You're going to have play dates. Now that anxiety has shifted from nervous energy to anticipation, positive anticipation, to a sense of belonging. So Jeff Chang is telling a story about belonging. He's telling a story about where we all belong to each other and where we grow and change in a positive way because of our association with each other, because of our love for each other, because of our caring for each other. Samuel Huntington is telling a breaking story. He's telling a story about the other taking our lunch money, stealing our jobs, stealing our women. Now notice, my granddaughter was agnostic. She wasn't about breaking or about bridging. It had to come through a narrative that was given to her. So a lot of times when we look at race, when we look at what's happening in the country, which look at what's happening in Sacramento, it's not simply that most people are principled racists. There's some, but that's not true of most people. But most of us, Black, white, Latino, Asian, Hmong, Native American, most of us struggle with change. And some people struggle even more. So as diversity grows, so does anxiety. The question is, will we take that anxiety and build bridges or build walls? Will we bridge or break? And what I want to suggest to you is that most of our activity and most of our stories are breaking stories. The stories about being different than the other. The stories about being afraid of the other. The stories about the others not being fully human. One of the things I want to leave with you, those of you in the foundation and those of you who are just caring citizens, is to learn to practice very deliberately first, bridging. Build bridges. But as my friend Bell Hooks says, bridges are made to walk on. So when you become a bridge between emerging communities, for that first few minutes, first few weeks, first few days, you may be walked on. Why do you care about those people? They don't look like us. They don't dress like us. They're not your people. Bridges are made to walk on. In that way, it's easier to break. It's easier to claim a small we, to define your people as people who look like you. What does it mean to look like me? Does it mean to be 6'3"? Does it mean to be a graying African American with a bad hip? How many of y'all are my people? So we have a president who wants to build an incredibly small we, who runs around appointing people for office, who believe the South was on the right side of the Civil War, who believes that if you don't do sexuality like some of us do sexuality, you don't belong. If you're a Muslim, if you're from South America. So to build this smaller and smaller we. And the consequences of that is not just attacking Muslims or attacking Mexican Americans or attacking immigrants. It's disuniting the United States. It's actually destroying our country, destroying our fundamental values. Now some people, as Dr. King would say, some good people, would prefer not to address these issues of race. I mean, can't we just all be people? I can't tell you how many times my good friends have said to me, John, I didn't even notice that you were black. And then my response oftentimes is, strange, because I certainly noticed that you were white. So the opposite of othering is not saming. One of the ways we want to deal with the complexity of diversity is to deny that it exists. It's reduce everybody to me. What a boring world. I'm pretty cool, but I don't want the whole world to be me. I'd get tired of myself. And fortunately, the whole world is not me. I was overhearing someone's conversation and they were saying, I'm smart by myself, but I'm not as smart as 10 people together. Diversity, properly constituted, is a strength, is a powerful strength. So the opposite of othering is not saming, it's belonging. Belonging doesn't deny our diversity, but also it doesn't deny our commonality. And it doesn't deny that both our diversity and our commonality are dynamic, are relational, are constantly changing. So what it means to be an African American today is not what it meant when I was born in the 1940s. In fact, I wasn't born an African American. I was born a colored boy. And then later, got tired of that label and someone said, no, you're not a colored boy, you're a Negro. And then it was like, well, Negro, interesting concept. And then there was this guy who said, I'm not a Negro. A couple of them. You might have seen the movie about James Baldwin. I'm not your Negro. Well, who are you, Mr. Baldwin, if you're not my Negro? And he was actually playing off of Malcolm X, because Malcolm X was the first public figure who said, I'm black. Now, interesting. You may think, well, black is a description of how you look. Well, then why did it take 20 years, from 1940s to the 1960s, to get from colored to black? Race blackness, whiteness, Latinoness, these are political spaces. And they're dynamic spaces. And they're constantly changing. And they can be spaces that use to bridge or to break. So we have a whole history of exclusion. Stay outside. Drink from your own water fountain. Oh, if you live in Flint, or maybe in the Central Valley, you shouldn't drink at all. Water's not so clean. So when we break, it's not simply how we think about people, it's how we treat people. It's how we organize opportunity. It's how we organize resources. So then we say, we're going to integrate. Come into my place. Come into my place. But the operative word is my place. You're here as a guest, so behave yourself. Don't mess with the furniture. This is my place. So belonging suggests it ain't your place. It's our place. And it's our place we co-create. You don't create it, I don't create it, we create it together. And it belongs to all of us. So it's not the same as diversity. This is a diverse group right now. But I dare say, Chet might say, some of y'all don't belong here after 5 o'clock. So you may not all belong in the same way. So it's not enough to have different people represented. People have to belong. Now, we're at a health foundation, so I want to talk about health a little bit. And, of course, you may know this. Health does not mean health care. It's not that health care is bad, but that's not the same as health care. And where you live matters a lot. So whether you're healthy or not depends in part on where you live. So we organize space to do race, to do issues of belonging or othering. So they're othering spaces, they're belonging spaces. When you show up in the wrong space, somebody might call the police. What are you doing here in this space that's not yours? So the government plays a role in terms of organizing, polarizing, and policing space on unequal terms. And we know now from years of research that space organizes disadvantage and advantage. And one way we could talk about space in this way is segregation. Now, some people today, it's like, well, you know, I don't care about segregation anymore. Segregation has never been about separating people of one phenotype from people of another phenotype by itself. Segregation has always been about organizing opportunity, organizing resources, organizing who belongs and who does not belong. Space tells you who gets municipal service, purchasing power, where are the good hospitals, where do we concentrate property crime, where are the environmental toxins, where are the abandoned buildings. Now, it won't surprise you that blacks and people of color generally have worse outcomes than their white counterparts. And even when we account for things like SES, socioeconomic status, we still see tremendous difference in terms of racialized outcomes. Part of it is space, but part of it is the way you treat it when you're in the space. So even a middle-class black woman with a college degree is more likely to have a premature baby than a white woman who drops out of high school. It's not supposed to be that way. Why is that? How do we make sense of that? Well, some of you may have seen Raj Chetty's study, Chad and I were talking about this earlier, and he's saying, there are all these indicators. It's like if you have more money, you're better off, generally speaking, certainly than having less money. If you live in a nice neighborhood. And so people like Charles Murray, it's not black people that we're against, it's black culture that we're against, the culture of poverty that we're against. And if black people would just get married, go to college, work hard, we wouldn't have anything against them, and they would have positive outcomes, health and otherwise. Whereas Chetty's study was sort of just pull the sheet back on that. And what he said is that even for black boys who grow up in a two-parent household, in a middle-class neighborhood, go to a good school, and have a household, not middle class, of $1 million, they're still, and these blue dots represent black boys, them falling out of their class at a much higher rate than any other group. How do you make sense of that, Professor Chetty? How do you make sense of that? And he actually suggests, I talked to him about it before he published the study, and he was talking about, how do I talk about this so people don't misunderstand it? And so we have to talk about it and explain it. And some people will misunderstand because they want to, and some people will understand. He's saying it's racism. So independent of your socioeconomic status, independent of where you live, independent of where you go to school, Yale student trying to study, what are you doing in this space? Racism doesn't go away. So all those things are confounding. Space, socioeconomic status, your family structure. All these things are related to how we do race, because race is a practice. But there's still more. There's something left over. And for many people, that's uncomfortable. It's like, let's not talk about race. I'm tired of talking about race. Can't we talk about, did you see that game last night between Cleveland and Boston? Wasn't that something? Yeah, it was a good game. But let's talk about race. It never goes away in America. And here's the thing. When most Americans think about race, what comes to mind? Tell me, what comes to mind? When you think about race, what comes to mind? Anyone?
I think, I guess, overt racism, like people being explicit about it, like actually, I don't know, I think
Okay.
that makes sense.
Yeah, no, you think about it as interpersonal. But does a group come to mind? When you think about race, does any particular group come to mind?
Black and white.
Blacks, okay. Black and white. All right. So what I want to suggest to you is that when most Americans think about race, they think about blackness. So let's talk about race, they mean talk about black people. I was teaching a class, two quick stories. I was teaching a class about racial discrimination at the University of Minnesota, and most of my students were white, and one of the students objected. It's like, why are we talking about black people? I said, I didn't say anything about black people. I said racial discrimination. That could be white people too. White people's a race. He said, oh, okay, go on. Later on in that same class, I'm teaching about how the United States acquired this vast array of land. And I started talking about taking the land from Native Americans. And again, one of the students raised his hand, Professor Powell, this is not a Native American class. Why are we talking about taking the lands from Native Americans? We're not interested in Native American history. I said, we're not studying Native American history. This is American history. This is your history. This is how you got this land. This is how we got this land. You don't know anything about Native Americans except we took their land. Oh. So what I want to leave you with as I move on to my PowerPoint is that race is primarily not about black people, but about whiteness. Not even white people, about whiteness. And most of us know very little about whiteness at all. So when you go home tonight, find out more about whiteness. Life expectancy. So white people live longer, and it's not because they have better genes. It's because of life conditions. This is from Tony Ayton. Some of you will know him. He's the vice president of California Endowment and a friend of mine. So for every 10% increase in poverty in a neighborhood you live in, you lose 3 years of life expectancy. So your realtor, when they show you the neighborhood and the house, they should say, you can live in this house and pay this amount of money, but you're going to die early. Or you can live in this house, it's more expensive, but you're going to have longer to pay for it because you're going to live longer. So the way we organize neighborhoods, the way we organize zip codes, we also organize health. How much money we spend normally relates to health. Except in the United States, we spend a lot of money and we don't get much health for it. Now there's a concept called the social determinants of health, which says, let's look at all these things, violence, the air, the neighborhood, the jobs. All these things affect our health, and it's called the social determinants of health. Now, the interesting thing about the social determinants of health, the same as the social determinants of race. So the things that actually give us health are the same things that give us race. Race is a set of practices, and they have to be worked at. They have to be put in place, and if you leave them alone, they start to drift. And if you don't believe it, look at any 2 census data sets. There's not consistency from one 10-year period to the next 10-year period. Race keeps shifting. We keep changing our mind. Okay, you can be a colored boy. All right, you can be African American. Okay, you can be something else. We keep changing our mind. And the social determinants of race is the same as the social determinants of belonging. So I want to introduce another concept called allostatic load. And basically what it is biometrics to sort of look at about 12 different ways of thinking about stress. And the body is constantly interacting with the environment and recording these stresses on the body. And the load for being black in America is a heavy load. We have high blood pressure in the black community in the United States. Now, some people say, well, that's just genetic. Except those same tribe of people living in Africa, they don't have high blood pressure. Some people say because they don't have many white people. But it's not white people. Remember, I said it's not white people, it's whiteness. So they don't have the stress of going into a Starbucks wondering if they're going to get arrested while buying their coffee. They don't have the stress of thinking about, if I go to Yale, I might not belong and get arrested. They don't have the stress when a police car comes behind them, thinking about, should I pull over? Should I call someone? So the stress, the story and the day-to-day stress of racism is associated with allostatic load. There's a load to be black in America. There's a load to be Native American in America. There's a load to be non-typical, non-normative in America, because we tend to create small we's. Now, networks matter. Networks is how you get your job. 83% of jobs are through networks. But there are networks that are powerful and uplifting and mobile in one direction. There are networks that are actually flat or depressing. But networks matter, not just individual networks. And so we have to look at what are the networks that people have, and give you 2 examples. The CDC did a study. They looked at black teenagers and white teenagers, and they were both engaged in about the same amount of sexual behavior. So the behavior was the same. Their outcomes were dramatically different. the black students or black teenagers were much more likely to have sexually transmitted disease than their white counterparts, even though they had the same sexual behavior. Anyone want to venture a guess as to why you had different outcomes with the same behavior? No one wants to guess? Okay. Here's the difference. The black networks were thick, which meant instead of my knowing Chet and Chet knowing this person, it's like we all know each other. So our networks are like this. They're crisscross. Where the white networks were thin. One person knew one person knew one person, or knew two people. For any kind of disease, if the network is thin, the disease travels slowly. That's how, because it travels through the network. If the network is thick, the disease travels much faster. So if you're studying disease, you need to study the network. Violence is a disease. And so disease travel much faster in a thick network, but so does positive stuff travel much faster in a network. Now, the highest suicide rate in the country is among Native Americans, Native American youth. The reason is networks. So if one person commits suicide, there's an exponential chance that someone else in that network will also commit suicide. A lot of the mental health work has not taken into account to look at Native American networks. So a predictor as to how well we are doing is determined by our networks. If you're trying to get someone to quit smoking, the best thing you could do is introduce them into a network of people that don't smoke. I already talked about our environment, and there's a concept called ambience belonging. Ambience belonging. Does your environment communicate to you that you belong or don't belong? When people don't belong, they don't do well. Mentally, they don't do well at their job. They don't do well in terms of their health. You notice oftentimes when there's unfortunately, way too frequently, another shooting in America, the first thing they say is, usually he, about 90% of those shootings are men. He was a loner. That's one of the dominant characteristics. So one of the things to think about in your network is, who do you call when you need something? So your network can be people you know, or your network can extend beyond people you know. It can be institutions, it can be organizations. Who do you call when you need help? Now think about this situation. Let's say you're a young man, young African-American man, and you're walking down the street at night and it's starting to get dark. You're in a neighborhood you don't really live in, but you have relatives there. And all of a sudden, a car starts following you. No, this is not the movie Get Out, although it could be. You're worried, though. You're concerned about your safety. Who do you call? Who am I talking about? Okay, let's continue the story. Let's see if it jars your memory. Let's flip it a little bit. So instead of the young man walking down the street, you're another young man in the car. And you see someone walking in your neighborhood that you don't recognize. And you're worried. So who am I talking about? What? Trayvon and Mark Zimmerman. So your network. You're Mark Zimmerman. Who does Mark Zimmerman call? The police. Who does the white woman in Oakland call when she's worried about barbecue? Who does the white student at Yale call when they're worried about someone in their dorm? Who does Trayvon Martin call? His girlfriend. Think about that. You're walking down the street, it's getting dark, a car is following you. You don't call 911, you call your girlfriend. For Trayvon Martin, the police is not in his sphere of network. He's never going to call the police. He's worried about his safety, but he calls his girlfriend. And I asked my black students at Berkeley, how many of you, if you were in Trayvon Martin's situation, would call the police? The answer was 0. There's something wrong with that. Something's wrong with that. I'm worried about my safety, and I don't call the police. And here's somebody worried about barbecue, and they can call the police. So networks matter. We have to make sure people have the right networks. So here are some allostatic load examples. And the main point is that we can measure allostatic loads. There's some indication that we can measure it without being intrusive. And when all these things are high, it means we're not healthy. Allostatic load is not an individual thing. It happens at a community level. So there's certain communities that not only are you more likely to die, you're more likely to feel stress. And you're not only more likely to feel stress, the stress doesn't stop. There's no relief. So notice, between white and black, with the purple being black, the gap between allostatic load keeps going up as we age. So our health is strongly influenced by our environment. So I'm going to start wrapping up, but I want to leave you with some ideas as to what you might do. So one is to transform the system. In order to do that, you need to work collectively. I'm not going to talk about it today, but the Sierra Foundation is already doing it. You need a targeted universalist approach. You need to build power. And you need to change the story. You need to think about partnerships where you align infrastructure and structures. You need to scale to play big. And you need to identify strategic allies. You need to build and support bridging and belonging. Now here's a pitch I give to foundations as often as I can. Very few of them listen to me when I say this, so y'all don't feel any pressure. But you need to support work that's explicitly bridging and creating belonging. Now, I've written papers about this. I'd be happy to send them to you if you just promise. You don't even have to read them. Nobody else does, so why should you? But anyway, my family, they're really great. It's like, that was a great paper you wrote. I don't know what you were talking about. But anyway. Belonging is actually, what I'm suggesting here is that belonging is maybe the most important. In fact, I've written a paper saying that. It's the most important thing society gives us withhold from people. It's more important than food. It's more important than housing. Because if you belong, all those things flow from that. And if you don't belong, none of those things flow from that. So it's hard to do social policy for people who don't belong. There's a part of the brain that lights up when we see another human being. Nature thought, wouldn't it be cool if humans could recognize each other? And they said, yeah, let's put this in here so they can recognize each other. So we literally have a part of the brain that lights up when we see another human being. Now here's the rub. When someone doesn't belong, when someone's deeply othered, that part of the brain does not light up. We literally, at an unconscious level, do not see certain people as people. And in fact, what does light up is the part of the brain associated with disgust. Now think about that. So here's a group of people I see as disgusting, not as people, and someone says, could we raise a few taxes to house them? Why would I do that? They're not even people. So what I'm saying is that belonging is critically important for everything else we're trying to do, and that the one way you get people to belong is through bridging. These are our people. These are my people. Tell empathetic stories. Make sure people are fully humanized. And the other thing that I want to suggest, especially to the Sierra Foundation, allostatic load is at a community base. So allostatic unload. How do we actually get allostatic load down? Now, very quick story, and I'm going to wrap up. I have a 97-year-old father. He keeps creeping along. I don't know how long he's going to keep creeping along, but when I get ready to go to India, he was in his 50s, maybe 60s, but I think he was in his 50s or 60s. And he said, John, he doesn't make many requests to me. He said, John, I don't know if you should go so far away because I'm not in good health. So I didn't go to India for like 4 or 5 years, and I thought, this could go on forever. So I went to India. My father has a lot of medical problems, heart problems, blood pressure problems. Here's the thing. If you think about for yourself, or for your family members, almost no one just have a heart attack. Oftentimes a person walking down the street, they're playing ball, my heart stopped, I'm feeling pain. That's not the way it works. The way it works is that your allostatic load starts going up, but it's asymptomatic. That is, I'm not aware that my heart is feeling stress until it reaches a critical joint. But we can measure that way before, so I can say, Chet, you look good, but I think you're starting to feel stressed. So in neighborhoods, what I'm suggesting, because there are other pretty simple ways of doing it. Part of it is through the technology. There are rings you can wear. There are the iPhone now, and it's not a plug for Apple, even though I consult with them. The Apple will actually send you a notice saying your heart is acting up before you know it. So you're not going to get a surprise heart attack. So I'm suggesting in communities we should create baselines for allostatic load. When it starts getting above a certain level, we should come up with the appropriate intervention before the heart attack, before the traumatic experience. Because children are not going to learn as well, parents are not going to parent as well, and people are going to die unnecessarily unless we actually catch these loads early. So make interventions to get the load down. There should be a cap that once a child's load gets so high, you don't have to take the test today, honey. You're having an allostatic load attack. Come back tomorrow when your load is down. This is a South African word, it's a Zulu word. It means, it's sababanu. It means I see you. Not that I notice you. When you go, when they talk about blacks being followed, they're not being seen, they're being noticed. What being seen means is I see you, including all your ancestors before you, your children and those after you. It means I see the full person. I see you. We all need to be seen. And the response is, I am here. I am fully here because you see me. I am because you are. And of course, the last quote there is by Cornel West, which is that justice is the public place of love. And it's important that we have people at the table. This is a video which I'm going to leave with you, and he talks about how after 9/11, women from the Middle East and Arab countries started having a lot of premature babies. Not because anyone attacked them, just the stress of being a Muslim or from a Muslim country after 9/11. And if you want more, my book is still on sale, and if you buy it, I'll give you a discount. Not really, but anyway, thank you.
Thank you. I'm Chet Hewitt, President and CEO of the Foundation. Can we have another round of applause for John? My task today is to do two things. One, I'm going to introduce and call up front two individuals who are going to provide some feedback to John's comments. John will join the panelists. We'll have a conversation, and we'll keep it short enough so that you can ask your questions as well. So let me first welcome Morningstar Dahle, who's the project director for Native Justice Now. And she is a member of the Pitt River Tribe, located in northwestern California. Morningstar is a leading edge fellow focusing on the disproportionate impact of the criminal and justice systems on Native Americans. She has worked as a tribal historic preservation officer for the Pitt River Tribe and with several other indigenous-led grassroots organizations in the Bay Area. She continues to lead large-scale actions while helping organize Native cultural, spiritual, scholarly, and political gatherings throughout California. Since 2008, she has been a host of KPFA's Bay Native Circle and is the proud mother of 4 children. Morningstar Dahle, please join us. We also have Virginia Knowlton Marcus, who's Director of Legal Advocacy for the Disability Rights in California. Virginia is a nationally recognized disability rights attorney who has been advocating for disability rights at the state, federal, local, and international levels for 25 years. Virginia returned to Disability Rights California in 2017 as Director of Legal Advocacy to lead a team of 125 lawyers, advocates, and other staff dedicated to advancing the civil rights of people with disabilities. She previously worked at DRC as Director of Public Policy. Prior to returning to California, she spent 11 years as a successful Executive Director of Disability Rights in Maryland, and she has also worked as Executive Director of the Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. Foundation in Washington, D.C., and serves on the board and an officer of the National Disability Rights Network, and co-chaired its legislative committee. Let me welcome up front Virginia Knowlton Marcus. And then our third panelist has joined us, and that is Nicholas Hatun. Nicholas, would you come up front and join us? And Nicholas is the founder and executive director of the San Joaquin Pride Center. A proven leader and agent for change, Nicholas has been instrumental in several movements that have received national recognition. He served previously as a political government relations consultant, whose clients range from Congressman Jerry McNerney in Stockton, Mayor Mike Tubbs, and NASA astronaut Jose Hernandez. He currently serves on the executive board of the American Leadership Forum, Great Valley Chapter, the steering committee of the California LGBT Health and Human Service Network, and was recently appointed to Governor Jerry Brown's California Complete Count Census Committee. As a passionate advocate for equality, Nicholas is inspiring San Joaquin County and our nation to be more tolerant and accepting of its diversity. Nicholas, welcome. Would you join us, John, as well? I'm going to start off this conversation by just asking our guests, and we'll start with you, Virginia, just to respond to John's comments and put it in the context of your work around inclusion as you try to counter otherness as relates to your work with the disabled community.
Thank you, Chet. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. There's so much there, I don't even know where to start, but I guess I'll start at the end when you talked about I see you, which I took to mean I appreciate you. And for people with disabilities, there has been a lot of not being seen. It's a history of segregation, discrimination. There were literally ugly laws. So if you look to disabled, malformed, you were literally not allowed to be seen in public. So I see you is huge. And I also, and the forced sterilization, like we don't want more of your kind. So without your consent, we will ensure that you can't procreate. And that happened here in California. It was the 70s when those laws came off the book in this state. And I did a lot of my work in Baltimore. I just recently came back, and I also thought about something that I think you all may have heard of, the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks. And Henrietta Lacks had a daughter who ended up in Crownsville, which is a now shuttered facility in Maryland, where the conditions were particularly horrid, particularly abusive particularly overcrowded, dismal, medical experimentations, some of them painful, without consent. And you won't be surprised to hear that that was the one mental health institution in the system that was segregated. It's all Black people. And that's to me, one of the quintessential forms of othering is this social construct that we have around mental illness and who's on what side of the line and who gets to decide. And we see disproportionate numbers of people of color in the deep ends of those systems, even in the juvenile justice system. So that was part of my reaction. The other thing that I thought was interesting was your talk around networks. And you know, the gesture that you were doing with your hands about the thick networks. And I thought about like layers of oppression where, and the allocentesis, yes? The burden of multiple layers of othering. So to have a visible disability, to have a lot of melanin, to have English as your second language, maybe with a thick accent, maybe to be in a wheelchair, maybe to be female, maybe to be non-cisgendered. The more ways of being others, they accumulate and really cause illness, cause premature death, cause suffering. So if there are solutions that we can talk about to get to ICU, that would get us a long way towards where we need to go to end mass incarceration, to end the violence that we see in our society, the discrimination, the racism, and it just seems so simple, but it's so difficult, just I see you. So that's my reaction.
Thank you. Thank you. Morningstar?
Thank you. What an amazing talk. And what an honor to sit here on this panel with all of you. So I want to thank Sierra Health Foundation for demonstrating the inclusivity that was spoken about today. I want to say that the beginning of the presentation where there was mention that we are still in a civil war, and I think that can go along the lines with, especially here in California, not only is there a civil war that this country is currently engaged in, but there is also the Indian wars that have continued. And so for California's indigenous peoples, just in the last 160 years, it wasn't that long ago. It was just 2 to 3 generations for my ancestors that were able to survive the state-sponsored genocide, that were able to survive the $1.5 million bounty that was placed on our heads. And so it doesn't look today like the bounties for our scalps and the enslavement of our children, but it looks like the incarceration of our Native youth. It looks like the incarceration and the displacement that in the foster care systems, it is a rate of 11 times for Native children that of non-Natives being displaced. There was mention of Alameda County and the sterilization efforts. I was born in Oakland during a time that Highland Hospital, the county hospital in Oakland, had the second highest infant mortality rate in the nation. And so my parents, who were active within the American Indian movement, made a very conscious decision to birth me at home. And I was one of a number of series of babies that were born at the Aim for Freedom Survival School. And it was very much that, to aim for the survival of the next generation because of the forced sterilization efforts on Native women, and in just addressing the statistics. We look at that today. We look at, how this country was founded on, sexual violence was used as a tool of colonization against Indigenous women. And we look at that today. We look at, the percentage rates. We had a conversation during lunchtime about policing and police violence. And when 74% of Indigenous women know their rapist, know their assailant, how is it that you call the police? How is it that you feel that you are safe within your community? And again, going back to connections, when our communities are so small and so intertwined, how is it that our young people can feel safe? And thrive in those environments in relation to their socioeconomic status.
Neil?
Well, I want to echo what Morningstar said in thanking Sierra for having an inclusive panel here. For somebody who's LGBT and also not from a major urban hub, it is rare for us to have a voice, and then to have a voice that is from a person of color. So I greatly appreciate being invited today. I couldn't help but think about the importance of policy, as you brought up. And I think we here in California have kind of kidded ourselves into thinking that we're leading. I'm a part of our Democratic Party, and so I went to their convention down in San Diego, and their theme was the Big Blue Beacon. And I just thought, how arrogant of us, because while we do advocate and successfully legislate policies, those policies don't reach everybody. And 40% of LGBT people live in parts of California where the policies don't get implemented. And the mandates go unfunded. And the majority of the money that is raised towards our LGBT movement go to that other 60%, hugely disproportionately. So bad that in the Central Valley, my organization was the only organization that had staff for 5 years. For 5 years, we were the only organization that had staff to support our community. That changed, luckily, last year, so now there's 2, Bakersfield and San Joaquin County. And so, I'm glad that we're all here having these discussions, and I truly look forward to hearing more about what we can do to eliminate some of these disparities.
Thank you. One of the things that John talked about was this notion of bridging, which was kind of the countering of otherness in many respects. In your work, in what ways are you seeing opportunities, even if they have not been fully realized yet, or perhaps you don't see any, where, where there are opportunities to bring people together? And I'll just use your example. There was probably a time when you wouldn't have been at the Democratic Convention. You talk about, progress. And I'm not suggesting at all that it's sufficient. But if we're going to get to this notion of bridging as a way of making real advances, give me some ideas or share your experiences. We'll try to do this briefly in terms of some of the things that you're seeing that are opportunities, whether they're in the policy space, whether it's something that foundations can do, or other institutions are engaged, from higher education to law enforcement.
I hope I remember how to do this right.
Mm-hmm.
All right, over there?
It's
Okay. So I think accountability. I think we're seeing communities, we're seeing individuals step up and hold people accountable. I was listening to NPR the other day, and Jerry Brown was joking about the fact they were asking him, why aren't you so aggressive about all these laws that are passing now, like you used to be when you were first governor? And he laughed and said, because the great secret is all these laws, they get watered down by the time they get passed, and then the legislators brag about the original intent of the legislation as if it's what's really happening. And so the fact that he thought he could say that in our state, one, cracked me up. But two, that more and more people now are fighting the system, and you have accountability where the state of California is now saying, oh, you're not going to spend this money, in particular Mental Health Service Act, we want it back. That's accountability. That's now creating change. Or in my county, despite the fact that the Board of Supervisors doesn't necessarily politically support LGBT people, are saying, okay, well, we better give the LGBT people some of that money now because we're not gonna have it. And so I think it's extremely important that we organize around local accountability and organize in cities and counties that are not these beacons, so that those people can benefit as well.
Okay, accountability being a big issue, local accountability in particular. Yeah.
So there was reference to storytelling earlier, so I'm gonna, and as Native people, we're storytellers, and we also talk in circles. So I'm gonna keep this as brief as I can in sharing a story about a tribal member from the Otsagewi band of my tribe, and she's 30 years old, and about 2 months ago, I was asked to write a letter in support of her because she was being accused. She was facing charges of a 200+ year sentence for being accused of having a weapon and using that weapon towards a peace officer. However, varying accounts, and there are actually no witnesses to this, but she was facing 200 years plus, and she is 30 years old. So I was asked to write a letter in support of her in addressing some of the social determinants within our community and how at the age of being a teenager and a young adult that our tribe did not have the resources available to meet her needs. So our tribe did not have an education department. Our tribe did not have a tribal justice system. Our tribe did not have, and the state of California still does not have those not only available mental health services, but those services available for substance abuse accessible to her. And so that 200 year plus charge was reduced down to 30 years. I just got the information this week. But how is it that you can celebrate that a 30-year-old who's just starting out their life and had all these varying factors is facing 30 years, which she'll possibly serve, 1/3, the 33.3% to 1/2 of that. And so when she's released at the age of 40 or 45, as a felon with, not only as a prior felon, but also as a violent felon, what chance does she have when she's released? And so I think that when we speak of opportunity, there's always that need for hope. There's always that need for resilience within our communities. That's why we are still alive today. And although we face the challenges of being invisibilized on our own lands, the fact that I can get up and I can go and hug my children, and I was behind the walls with so many sisters and grandmothers and aunties that may not ever get that opportunity again is what keeps me going. And what, is the reason why I'm here today, to be able to share these stories and share these are the current realities within our tribal communities, and to somehow be a voice so that we can support not only this sister, but so many of our tribal youth and relatives that are currently behind those walls.
Wow.
Same question, which is I'm going to ask you to kind of think and be brief as you possibly can. But where do you see some opportunities to do some of the type of bridging work that John was talking about as well?
Well, I see a real opportunity that California has in the tens of millions of dollars of Mental Health Services Act money that are unspent. And we were talking during lunch about the criminalization of disability, the intersection of blackness and disability and mass incarceration. And in my community, when I was living in Baltimore, a young black man with a disability, Freddie Gray, was killed by police. And there were uprisings and turmoil, and the Department of Justice came in and did a 14-month investigation and issued a 65-page report in August 2016 that found many abuses, many problems, but a real targeting and policing of that community where there's a high concentration of people with disabilities, black folk, and poverty. And we were talking about what are some of the solutions to that. The disability discrimination, the race discrimination, and there were so many stories that were laid out in that investigation report about people who were clearly in mental health crisis and needed help, traumatized people who needed help, and there was no one to call but the police. And so the police came in, and sometimes the results were fatal. So, that is money that is available to try something different, where crisis intervention, people with training, people who are mental health survivors themselves, not people with the training that the police have and the orientation that the police have, to have places where people can go and be safe and recover, instead of cycling in and out of emergency departments and jails. So I think there's a real opportunity there to innovate and get better outcomes for people.
I want to do something a little bit different. I'm going to come back to John now because John said earlier that he was called out of our lunch meeting because he was doing some consultation with Starbucks around its situation. And I'm going to assume that Starbucks pays you pretty well for that type of consultation. We're going to get John to give us some free consultation today. How about that? And so I'm paraphrasing here a little bit, but you talked about resources. And California is in a great budget place today. Over $2 billion of unanticipated money in the budget. And as we move into budget season, California is thinking about what it's going to do and where it's going to spend some of its largesse as well. And this is outside of its need to create some type of reserve for the downtime. At Morningstar, you talked about voice and presence, and it calls to mind a level of activism that we're seeing, particularly in young people, that we haven't really seen in this country for some time. And whether it's about guns or Black Lives Matter or any number of issues, what you really see is a level of activism amongst folks that I think holds some potential and opportunity if it can be organized and used in the appropriate ways. And then you talked about accountability, which is a huge part of this. Accountability to whom and for what outcomes, which I think is a really big question as we think about, how do we move to a level of inclusion and acceptance of our diversity, to paraphrase. So John, as you think about the times in which we live in and the overlay in terms of where we are with our national politics, how do you think about accountability, this kind of rise of advocacy, particularly with youth voice, in a sense in California, that we actually have some money that we could put to play to do good work in a number of areas that we have been lacking in investing in since the Great Recession?
Well, those are, I think this is on, those are important questions. And let me come back to the issue. So I work with the Black Worker Center. Some of you may know them. They're all around the country. And going back to your original question about bridging, so I talked to some of the centers. So they're trying to move people on the issues of work and basically, rightfully so, saying that blacks are underemployed and we need to address that. And then I remind them of the point that the group that's most unemployed as a group are the disabled groups. And I say, why don't you bridge And of course, a lot of those disabled people are also black. But why don't you bridge so that this is people who are underemployed and bring in the disabled group? Now, most of them haven't said yes or no, but it's a bridge. And you're saying the issues are related, but they take on different forms. Just to give you one other example, there's another group I'm working with in Michigan. They got a large pot of money to do work around drug problems. And I said, okay, I suggest that you actually situate your work in rural, suburban, and urban Michigan. You're going to bridge between 3 different populations who actually have different ways of expressing the drug problems. Then you build a story and a connection so that people get to see that these problems are migrate across these differences. And they said yes. So on the issue of activism and accountability, I think it's complex in a couple of ways. The sort of bad news is activism doesn't translate into change just by itself. And unless you actually, in some ways, figure out how to change institutions, activism does not necessarily translate into long-term change or even civic engagement. I'll give you a concrete example. I talked to Chet about this earlier. We're doing a lot of work around water. So we look at in Flint, which people are very exercised and active on the issue of water, being poisoned by the water in Flint. But then we went back and sort of tracked them to see how much of that turned into engagement beyond the water issue and toward institutional change. It was almost zero. So I guess I would say if you want activism to actually be more than just not to be disparaging, but a protest or a march, you need to actually build it in and think about it. And this is actually really important. If you think about Arab Springs, I was teaching at Berkeley when the Arab Springs happened, and my students, and I was supportive of what was going on in the Arab world. And they said, so do you think there's going to be some radical change in the Arab world? I said, probably not, because it doesn't have any kind of institutional legs. And in fact, the people who had the institutional legs were the right wing, and they came in and took it over. So there's more than just activism. You need, and now, I'm giving you all this free advice. If you don't take it, it's going to be a heavy charge. I'm a researcher, so I go out and study things like what makes things change. And sometimes you give bad news to people because people get, like in Flint, people get riled up and say, great, but you want institutional change. Or in Ferguson, you want institutional change. How do you actually make sure that happens? We actually know something about that. And the last thing I said, going back to, you want government to be accountable. You want institutions to be accountable, but you want more than that. You want them to be you. We're one of the few countries, if you go to France, people don't think of government is over there. It's like, it's my government. It's what I was saying about, it's our space. It's not your space and you're inviting me in, it's our space. How do we actually get people not just to belong in terms of, I did something with NFL around protests in sports, really kicked off by Kaepernick in terms of taking a knee. So I met with a lot of NFL players. Two things that was very interesting about that. One, they're making a lot of money. There's a book called $40 Million Slave. They don't feel empowered. They're not well organized. And I'm not, they don't have a real plan. They don't have a real strategy. So it's not going to go anywhere. It's not going to, it's really important to lift people's voice, lift people's consciousness. But then how do you actually translate that into some action that's sustainable? And how do you do it in a way that each player, like Colin, can't be picked off? So I think that you have to think about it in sort of multiple ways. If not, you'll have a very powerful expression, but it won't have the kind of transformational change which I think you're talking about.
The last part of that question was really around resources and finding California in an interesting place after years of not having a great budget, and that has not been true about most of our current governor's tenure. And let's just say we take this notion of being more inclusive and feeling like government is ours. And I kind of feel like that's part of this voice. In some ways, it is the process of taking a back government. This notion of kind of really applying pressure to invest in the things that are actually moving us forward, dealing with some of the social issues. Any advice that you would give to this particular group about how they can organize themselves to get at this notion of inclusion? And let me just say this, I'm a former county welfare director, and this notion of the deserving poor has been with us for a very long time, right? And we have always made people feel as if we didn't invest in that community or that particular group because somehow they were less deserving of being included. It was the way that we framed welfare reform in 1996. It was the Cadillac driving black welfare mom. Or how we thought about criminal justice in many, many respects. When we're thinking about kind of reframing those particular narratives and doing the types of things that both change the institutional structures, but also responding to immediate needs that people have, because one's a longer term agenda and one is something you can turn around more rapidly. Any advice that you would give this particular group about where they and how they should be spending their time? Because I think we all agree that you need to do both.
Right. And again, complex questions. So 2 quick examples. So first of all, I would say to the group, and including us on the panel, that when you think about the group that you work most closely with and maybe even identify with, how do you build bridges to other groups? Very consciously. So if I work on issues of racial discrimination, how do I build bridges to gender discrimination? How do I build bridges to immigration discrimination? How do I do, if I'm heterosexual, how do I build bridges to people who are not heterosexual? And we don't do that very often. We know the right is sort of aggressively breaking, but we actually don't build bridges as well either. And so I would say be deliberate about that, both for our own spiritual and deep humanity, but also it makes sense politically. So I'm working in Detroit on water. Detroit's a city of 700,000 people. The region is 4 million people. And we've issued a report on water, not issued it, we've sort of done the first draft. It doesn't include anyone outside Detroit. In fact, the people outside Detroit are put in the role of villains. And outside of Detroit, if you know Michigan, it's mainly white, not exclusively. And so in some way that makes sense, but it's a breaking strategy. And I say to people, and I won't insist, but I say, with 700,000 in a region of 4 million, you can't win without building bridges. End of story. Now, you may not want to win. It may be okay for you not to win. It may be okay to say, and what I suggested as a solution, because people say, we want to tell our story. And our story is that the white suburbs are racist and they're SOBs and they screwed us with the water. That's part of the story. It's not the whole story. And so my suggestion was in the report, we say this is an ethnographic report. People will speak in their own voices. We're not going to mute people. But we also realize there are multiple stories, which create, again, with a deliberate plan to bridge. So I think the money is an opportunity. I think there will be some horse trading that goes on. I think part of the things you do is build infrastructure, use some money you talked about in terms of infrastructure for the gay community in rural areas. But I think you want to build something that when the money turns down, you still have something there. And it's quite powerful. So it's not dependent on money. I think in terms of accountability, that if you're collectively requiring accountability, not simply accountable to the Black community, not simply accountable to the disabled community, not simply accountable to the Native community, but accountable to us collectively, and we stand together, then it's hard to ignore us. And they had a very successful effort of that in Minnesota. They tried to split groups by saying, we have a little money, this group or that group has to decide how we're going to split the money. The group stood together and said, no, we're not going to be divided. You have to do these things for all of us. So I think the groundwork for the connectivity is really quite powerful, and it builds power. And in that power, you also build accountability. You can think about that with the police. I know right now there's obviously an issue here with policing. And so, and again, I'll stop after this. The policing issue is really interesting because what we know is that Black Lives Matter, too, that a lot of Black people are gunned down in the streets. What most people don't know, which you obviously do know, that somewhere between 30 to 40% of those gunned down are actually disabled. And so it's not just a Black issue, it's also an issue of disability. But those two narratives haven't been brought together. They're distinct, and that's problematic.
Neil?
I just wanted to say something that I probably will never ever say again, and that's thank you to President Donald Trump. The day after his election, a group of leaders on their own kept receiving text messages and emails concerned about civil rights. And these same organizations for the past year, Sierra Health and other foundations have been saying, y'all need to work together. Y'all need to be working together. Y'all do great work alone, but y'all need to be working together. And we found ourselves marching to Stockton City Hall. And we're lucky we got newly elected mayor, Michael Tubbs. And he stood there and he told us, if you are Muslim and you live in Stockton, we love you. If you are undocumented and you live in Stockton, we love you. And if you're LGBT, and then he stopped. Knowing what was going to happen with the new administration, he said, if you are transgender and you live in Stockton, we love you, and you are all our family. That moment was so inspiring for all of us that we have built a collaborative that is kicking ass in Stockton, getting foundation funding and making some real change, including getting the county to step up and provide $1.1 million for Mental Health Services Act, for innovation, preventative, and outreach money. And so I agree 100% of the importance of bridges, the importance of organic bridges, and the importance of working as a coalition to hold your local governments accountable.
Intentional bridge building. Let's start taking some questions from the audience. Anyone on the panel? I know we have some folks who are going to move some of the microphones around, and if you have a question, raise your hand. We'll call on you, and we'll have the directed panelists, if you have a question for someone specifically, or we'll give everyone a shot to respond as well. Questions?
Hi, Laura Podolsky. I'm with the University of California Institute of Transportation Studies, so I'm picking up on a lot of the discussion around the spatialness of segregation, some of these issues. And so I was curious, I know I've read your bio, John Powell, and you've written about, studied affordable housing, urban sprawl. And so I'm thinking from this transportation point of view, what could we be doing and thinking about to help address some of these issues you've discussed today? And specifically, in 2016, the legislature passed SB 1000, which directed cities and counties to address environmental justice in their general plan. And so if you have specific comments on that, on what we could be thinking about and how do we take advantage of that opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Is this working? Okay. So the problem is that all these are complex systems. Transportation is about connecting people to something. And I appreciate you reading my work. And one of the pieces I wrote is called opportunity-based housing. So housing is not simply a place you live. Housing should be thought of in terms of connecting people to opportunity. And a lot of times housing is not. And so, and then transportation becomes even more important. The group that use transportation, the group that's most dependent on transportation, public transportation in the United States are Black women. I worked with Austin. They were building a new light rail line. It wasn't going to serve Latino populations. I met with the head of Dahle Corporation and basically say, you know, it's like a rail line to nowhere. If you look at LA has the fastest growing rail line in the country, but it's not actually serving low-income people. It's actually, I mean, it's really a terrible story. What they do is they put hubs, transit stops, and they become attractive because they build shops and stuff around it. And then the hipsters move in, they drive up the rent and drive the housing, and then they don't use the rail line. So the rail line is there, but literally ridership is going down as they build more rail lines because the people who would use them, people of color, women, people, are being pushed out. So you got to deal with all those things together. These are complex systems. You got to do and bring people in. And sometimes people will see problems as they will redefine problems in their own way. So again, when I mentioned in Detroit about water, first iteration there was a group, Sierra Club is there, and they were saying this is we want to build green infrastructure. And frankly, a lot of the Black community is like, what? We don't care S about green and infrastructure. We want water. So part of it is like, you got to lift up people, bring them to the conversation, engage them in the conversation. And then you have to sort of do some background work. We were part of a bill that went down in fire, although it's going to come back, of building mixed income housing on transit stops. And it was being supported by the Senate. And I was telling Chip about this, but it was opposed by developers, by cities, because we were saying it should be statewide, and the cities were saying, you can't tell us what to do in Berkeley, and by housing advocates who have the experience that if you build new housing, it's going to push people out. But they're talking about building market rate housing. We're talking about building affordable housing, and they couldn't make the distinction on transit stops to actually get people off the road. So there's a lot of politics that have to happen. And the last thing I'll say while I have the mic, Chet, is that we give small grants at the University of California to our 7 clusters. And we say to them, if you're we have a disability cluster, we have a gender cluster, we have a race cluster. We say, if we get 1 grant application from the 3 of you, it's more likely to be funded, and it's more likely to be funded at a higher level. So we're saying we'll pay you. We're putting money on the table. You can leave the money on the table if you want to, but we think you're more powerful when you work together. So we're going to literally underwrite that. But you can do the same thing with transportation. Say transportation, environment, water, bring it together, and make it happen.
Other questions?
Thank you. Hi, my name is Shirley Shelton. I'm from Government Department of Public Health, and I'd just like to do a shout out to the 2 young ladies that teed us off today. I think their presentation was absolutely stunning and powerful. So thank you for that inclusion. As I think about our topic today, race, racism, and otherness, it's a powerful topic, it's profound, and it just makes you just think about, it's not that it's a new topic, it's old. We've been talking about it for a long time. It's uncomfortable, but we do a bit about it. We've been addressing it incrementally. So working in the institution, if you will, of government, I guess my question would center around how do we work towards building bridges so that it's not a one-off and we're not doing the politically correct thing because of requirements or it's the right thing to do, but to really integrate it to be a truly sincere, vital part of our fabric on an everyday basis, so that we all are at the table from the ground up. And it's not just at the lower level, but it's diversity that's included throughout on a regular basis, so that when we talk about racism and we have these, when I point out that we have racist practices, I don't have to quantify and I don't have to justify what I mean and where are the facts, because we do. When we have these conversations, that's what we're asked. Is that your judgment or your facts? So I know that's kind of a broad question, but.
That's okay, and we'll allow anyone on the panel who wants to take a correct it. When you're talking about, being in institutions, and I know that, part of your role as a disability rights attorney is to sometimes have tough conversations with institutions about their treatment of individuals. When you enter that space, and institutions tend to want to be defensive first, right? It's almost like stages of grief. The first thing you encounter is a level of defensiveness. What have you done in order to, get people to be honest and open about difficult conversations that large institutions do need to have around how race plays out within their particular institution?
Good question. Thank you for your question. I was describing during the lunch that at Disability Rights California is one of a national network of organizations. So there's an organization like ours in every state and territory, and we're a federally mandated watchdog. And so when we were created, we were given a statutory authority to do investigations in facilities where people with disabilities are found, where we have probable cause to believe they have been or are being abused and neglected. So we have been using our access authority in recent years here in California to do investigations in county jails. And so we get in because, you know, they have to let us in when we have probable cause, and that's been litigated. We haven't had to litigate it in those instances in California. So we're able to go in, we're able to talk to the prisoners, we're able to talk to the staff, we're able to access records, and so we've done a few of these investigations now where we have been able to enter into structured negotiation agreements with the county, with the sheriff in those facilities. I can't talk too much about it. I mean, there is one that you can access online if you want to find it. The name of the case is Murray, and so we recently settled one of these in Santa Barbara County. But one thing that's actually really helpful is to find the people in there who want change, who can help drive the change from the inside, and you have to go in with a certain humility. You let people tell their own stories. I mean, what's happening to people in these facilities, the misuse and overuse of segregation of people who have mental health disabilities for whom it's contraindicated, the lack of mental health treatment, the lack of medical treatment speaks for itself. And so you find where people are willing to recognize that there's a problem and that change is needed, and that's the moment where you stop beating people over the head and you work with them. And that's been sort of an effective strategy for us, where we will publicly say, you know, we really appreciate that the county is willing to take these steps. Here's all the other steps we think they should take, you know. So that's our way.
Yeah, I want to come back to John on this, but I want to, you know, you have the kind of force of law behind your inquiry. Morningstar, sometimes, despite the history of it all, you don't step into those spaces with the force of law. How have you been able to engage, you know, institutions who need to think, you know, differently about inclusiveness when you don't have the force of law as kind of your door opener?
Sure. So what I'm thinking of is, you know, advocacy in terms of survivor advocacy. So uplifting those voices. So for example, Native women on reservations are killed at 10 times the national average on some reservations. 84% of Native women have experienced violence in their lifetimes. There's a report by there's a resource guide by the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center for young Native girls. And the title of the guide is What to Do When You Are Raped. And so to be in this day and age where as a young Native girl, you know, it's not if, it's when you are raped. Here are some resources to support you. And it's, the language in it is geared towards very young girls. So as a mother of 3 young children, I feel like these are the conversations that we need to be having when we talk about state violence, when we talk about boarding school violence. This is what is missing in that equation. And so we're not going to the perpetrators necessarily and saying, don't rape. We're not going to, those that have caused harm in our communities. We are going to these young girls and providing this outreach tool. And so I think that having that level of advocacy, not only that they can speak to their experience, because it's not always for our communities, it's not always going to be that solution. That solution isn't going to come from the legal system. And that's just the reality of it.
Else you want to take
empathy, and empathy within our own movement. I go around San Joaquin County in some uncomfortable spaces, some very, very conservative spaces and rooms, and our job is to win them over, and we do a pretty good job of it, I like to think. But when I go into a big space with a bunch of people that I think are my advocates, and I ask them, imagine a young transgender girl of color and the struggles that she has, and I get told I can't imagine that, that tells me we got a lot of work within our own movement. Because I need you to understand that, especially if you're working in the foster aid industry, where we have a disproportionate number of LGBT youth in that system, but if you can't see them, you can't help me help them. And those are the hurdles that I, have to deal with more often, than dealing with the person with the individual prejudices who grew up in a more conservative space.
Mm-hmm. John, anything you'd like to contribute as a...
A couple of things. First, just to thank the panel and the audience. There's actually, and I don't know how it's going to work, but augmented reality is actually trying to do some of that. They're trying to actually create virtual reality so you can more easily step into someone else's experience. So you can, and we'll see how that works. I mean, I think it's an interesting idea, but I think your point is well taken, that we do need empathy, and we do need to be able to connect with other people. Also, I want to just challenge a little bit what I heard you say. I don't think these are the same things that we've seen before. I think we're in a new space. I think it's a much more dangerous space. And I say that not because it's like correct, but I think we are at a critical point in the history of the planet and the history of our lives. A lot of people who are deep into climate change basically say we've already crossed the tipping point. We're seeing the kind of right-wing nationalism around the world that we haven't seen since World War II. We're seeing vitriolic. So I want to just nudge just a little bit. There's something different about what's happening now. And yes, racism has been around a long time, but the capacity to sort of populate the capacity for state violence, the capacity sort of to control it. The White House was not always a beacon of enlightenment, but neither were they, a complete drag on everything. We're literally seeing people saying Brown board education was wrongly decided. We're really, when we have someone who's running for Senate, being supported by the President of the United States, who says slavery wasn't so bad and maybe we should go back. That's an amazing place to be in. So there's this urgency, and I think we have to be real about it. It's like you think it can't get any worse, and then they do something else that's worse still. So I do think we have to come together, and I think that's the good news and the bad news. I work with a lot of nonprofits. I work with a lot of community groups, but I also work with some of the richest countries in the world. I work with Apple. I work with Google. I work with Starbucks. They are struggling. I work with Warren Buffett. I work with whatever. My point is that they are lost too, because if the world blows up, people ain't gonna be buying coffee. Just saying, So they have a stake in this. Now, their stake is not going to be the same as ours. They're not going to be, they're going to embrace capitalism. But there's these places where we can actually bridge with them. I'll give you just one example. I was the negotiator for NAACP around mortgage crisis after subprime. And so we sat down with Wells Fargo, which is the largest mortgage lender in the world. And I would say things about these systems of racialized systems of mortgage, and we need to do this. And two things happened. So we were leaving a meeting, and one of the guys from the NAACP, he says, I don't get it, John. He said, what? He said, you say really hard things to these people, but they seem to like you. And I say, well, I like them too, but they got to change. I mean, he said, but they don't like me. I said, how do you feel about them? He said, I can't stand them. And it was not that was enough, but what he was saying is that there's no bridge. And these people, these were vice presidents of Wells Fargo, and they were talking about their constraints, how they couldn't do something. And there was one instance where I was talking about going into some mortgages and figuring out who the owners were, and the law says you can't do that. And so the guy cited the law to me. He said, well, the law says you can't do it. Now, I know they got that law passed. It's their law. And I said, we can't do it, but you can. And he just smiled. So my point is that there are ways of working with people even when they're on the other side. And they're powerful examples of that. Nelson Mandela sort of represent one of the most powerful examples of that. And that doesn't mean you give people a pass. It doesn't mean you let people kill you or put you on but be open to the possibility that a lot of people who are apparently on the other side have pain, have constraints. They're trying to find their way. And if they won't join the team, fine, you make another team. But don't start off by saying, because they work in a corporation, because they're in government, because they're white, because they're straight, because they're Republican, I can't begin to talk to them. You can begin to talk to them. You can always end the conversation.
And with that, we're going to bring today to a close. Let's thank our panelists.